The Boeing 737 shuddered violently at 37,000 feet. Oxygen masks dropped like yellow flowers. From the cockpit came a terrifying scream, "Captain! Wake up!" 300 passengers held their breath as their pilot collapsed from a massive heart attack, leaving them falling helplessly through the dark sky. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The Boeing 737 cut through the evening sky at 37,000 feet, its cabin filled with the usual sounds of a packed flight, muffled conversations, crying babies, the hum of engines. Sarah Martinez sat in seat 12C, staring out the small window at the darkening clouds below. She'd chosen the aisle seat out of habit, always needing a quick exit, always watching. At 52, Sarah looked like any other business traveler. Gray-streaked hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, reading glasses perched on her nose, a worn paperback novel in her lap. The young man beside her had been trying to start a conversation for the past hour, but she'd kept her responses polite and brief. She preferred it that way, invisible, unremarkable. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Chicago. Please return your seats to the upright position and..." The announcement cut off abruptly. Sarah's head snapped up. In all her years of flying, she'd never heard an announcement end like that. The silence stretched on, heavy and wrong. Around her, passengers began to murmur, looking around with confused expressions. Then came the scream from the cockpit. "Captain! Captain, wake up!" The voice belonged to First Officer Jenny Walsh, though the passengers didn't know that. What they heard was pure terror, barely contained, bleeding through the thin cockpit door. The murmuring stopped. Every conversation died. Sarah was already unbuckling her seatbelt when the plane lurched violently to the left. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like yellow flowers blooming in fast forward. Passengers screamed. A woman across the aisle began sobbing. The man next to Sarah gripped his armrest so hard his knuckles went white. "What's happening?" he whispered. Sarah didn't answer. She was listening to the engines, feeling the way the plane moved beneath her feet. The descent was too steep, too fast. Something was very wrong. Flight attendant Marcus Rodriguez burst through the curtain separating first class from coach, his face pale but determined. "Is there a doctor on board?" he called out, his voice barely steady. "We need a doctor immediately." A woman in seat 8A raised her hand. "I'm a nurse. Come with me, please. Quickly." As they disappeared behind the curtain, Sarah caught a glimpse of the cockpit door standing wide open. Inside, she could see the silhouette of someone slumped over the controls. The plane shuddered again, harder this time. A cart broke free from its restraints and rolled down the aisle, scattering drinks and snacks. Children were crying now, their parents trying to comfort them while fighting their own panic. "He's having a heart attack," Sarah realized. The captain's having a heart attack. She'd seen it before in a different life. In the deserts of Afghanistan, when Lieutenant Colonel Phillips had clutched his chest during a briefing and collapsed. The same desperate energy, the same barely controlled chaos. But this wasn't a military base with medics on standby. This was a commercial flight with 300 souls on board, 37,000 feet above the earth, and no one qualified to land the plane. No one except her. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Her hands on the stick of an F-16, the desert rushing past at 600 miles per hour. The radio crackling with coordinates. The weight of responsibility, the weight of lives, not just her own but the soldiers on the ground counting on her. "Phoenix 1, you are cleared for attack run." "How copy?" "Phoenix 1 copies. Going in hot." Sarah shook her head, forcing herself back to the present. That was 15 years ago. She was a different person now, living a different life. She sold insurance and drove a Honda Civic and had a small apartment with a cat named Pilot, an ironic name she'd chosen in a moment of dark humor. But the plane was still falling. Marcus appeared again, his professional mask slipping. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please keep your seatbelts fastened and..." "The captain's had a heart attack, hasn't he?" The voice that spoke was calm, steady, and belonged to Sarah. She was standing in the aisle now, though she didn't remember getting up. Marcus stared at her. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. The first officer is trying to fly alone, but she's never landed a plane this size by herself. The autopilot is off and she's scared." Sarah took a step forward. "How am I doing so far?" "Ma'am, I can help." Something in her voice made Marcus pause. It wasn't the tone of a panicked passenger offering assistance she couldn't provide. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. "Are you a pilot?" he asked quietly. I was. Sarah looked toward the cockpit. F-16S. Air Force. 12 years, including 3 deployments. Marcus's eyes widened. Around them, nearby passengers were listening now, hope and desperation mixing on their faces. Fighter jets are different than commercial aircraft, Marcus said, but his voice had changed. There was hope there now, competing with doubt. Flying is flying, Sarah replied. Physics don't change. Trust me, I've landed bigger planes than this in worse conditions. That wasn't entirely true. She'd never actually landed a commercial airliner. But she'd landed cargo planes during her Air Force days, and she'd flown simulators for fun after retiring. More importantly, she understood flight dynamics, navigation systems, and how to stay calm when everything was falling apart. When Sarah was 25 and freshly promoted to captain, she'd been flying a night mission over Kandahar when her F-16's hydraulics failed. No power steering, no landing gear, flames licking at her engine. The radio had been full of voices, ground control, other pilots, everyone trying to help. But in the cockpit, it had been just her and the machine, dancing together at the edge of disaster. Phoenix 1, recommend you eject. Repeat, recommend immediate ejection. She'd looked down at the lights of the base below, thought about the ground crew who'd worked on her plane, the intelligence officers counting on her photos, the soldiers who needed her to come home and fly again tomorrow. Negative tower. I'm bringing her home. And she had. The plane bucked again, pulling Sarah back to the present. A flight attendant was helping an elderly man who'd hit his head when the cart broke free. In the cockpit, she could hear Jenny Walsh talking rapidly to air traffic control, her voice rising with each exchange. Let me help, Sarah said again. Marcus looked toward the cockpit, then back at her. What's your name? Sarah Martinez. Captain Sarah Martinez, retired. Wait here. He disappeared through the curtain. Sarah could hear muffled conversation, urgent whispers. The plane continued its uncontrolled descent, and she could feel the minutes ticking away. At their current rate, they had maybe 10 minutes before they'd be too low to recover. Marcus returned with Jenny Walsh behind him. The first officer looked young, maybe 30, with short blonde hair and eyes wide with barely controlled terror. You're really Air Force? Jenny asked. 12 years. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Flew everything from F-16s to C-130s. Jenny's face crumpled with relief. I can't do this alone. I mean, I can fly, but landing? Jim always handled the landings. I've never brought down a plane this heavy without him talking me through it. Sarah nodded. What's his condition? Stable but unconscious. The nurse thinks it was a massive heart attack. He's alive, but... Jenny shook her head. He's not waking up. Okay. Sarah looked toward the cockpit. I need to see the controls. The cockpit of a Boeing 737 was nothing like the cramped confines of an F-16. Where Sarah was used to a single seat surrounded by switches and displays, this was a wide space with 2 pilot seats and what seemed like thousands of instruments spread across multiple panels. But the basics were the same. Altitude indicator, airspeed, heading. The yoke that controlled pitch and roll. Throttles for engine power. Radio controls. Captain Jim Morrison lay slumped in the left seat, an oxygen mask over his face. His chest rose and fell slowly, but his face was gray. The nurse, Patricia, she'd introduced herself, was monitoring his pulse. His heart rate is weak but steady, Patricia said quietly. But he needs a hospital. Soon. Sarah slid into the right seat next to Jenny. Where are we? About 40 miles southwest of Chicago. We were cleared for descent when... Jenny's voice trailed off. What's our altitude? 22,000 feet, descending at about 1,500 feet per minute. Too fast, much too fast. Sarah's hands moved over the controls, muscle memory taking over even though these weren't the instruments she was used to. What did ATC say? They've cleared us for emergency landing at O'Hare. Runway 10R. But I've never... I mean, this plane is so heavy and with just me. You're not just you anymore. Sarah adjusted her headset. Chicago approach, this is United 447. Be advised we have a new pilot in command. Former Air Force Captain Sarah Martinez taking over for the incapacitated captain. The radio crackled. United 447, Chicago approach. Copy, new pilot in command. Captain Martinez, what's your experience with commercial aircraft? Sarah hesitated for half a second. Limited. But I'm qualified and capable. Request full emergency response and guidance for approach. Roger, United 447. Emergency vehicles are standing by. We're going to take good care of you. First, I need you to level off at 15,000 feet. Sarah's hands found the yoke and throttles. The plane responded differently than an F-16, heavier, more sluggish, but it responded. She pulled back gently on the yoke while reducing throttle, feeling the massive aircraft slowly begin to level out. There you go, Jenny whispered. Oh my God, there you go. In the cabin behind them, Sarah could feel the change. The sickening sensation of falling was replaced by steady, controlled flight. She heard someone cheer, quickly hushed by others. The first time Sarah had landed on an aircraft carrier, she'd been so terrified she could barely hold the stick steady. The deck looked impossibly small, the ocean impossibly vast. Her instructor's voice had been calm in her earpiece. Just fly the plane, Martinez. Trust your training. The boat will be there. She'd caught the wire on her first try, the sudden deceleration slamming her forward against her harness. When she climbed out of the cockpit, her legs had been shaking so badly she could barely stand. Good job, Nugget, the landing signal officer had said. Now do it again. And she had. Again and again until it became second nature. United 447 Chicago approach. Turn left heading 090 for vectors to final approach. Sarah banked the plane left, feeling 300 people move with her. In the cabin, she could hear Marcus and the other flight attendants preparing everyone for landing. Their voices were calm now, professional. The panic was fading, replaced by something else. Oh. How many hours do you have in type? The controller asked. Sarah looked at Jenny, who was monitoring the instruments and working the radio controls Sarah wasn't familiar with. 0 hours in this aircraft type, Sarah admitted. But I've got over 3,000 hours military, including heavy transport. A long pause. Copy that, United 447. We're going to talk you through this step by step. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah flew the approach under the guidance of Air Traffic Control and Jenny Walsh. The first officer proved to be an excellent co-pilot, handling the radios, managing the complex systems Sarah didn't know, calling out airspeeds and altitudes. As they descended through 10,000 feet, Chicago sprawled out below them. The city lights twinkled like stars, and Sarah could see the parallel runways of O'Hare stretching out ahead. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, their lights flashing red and blue in the darkness. Landing gear down, Jenny called out, throwing the switch. Sarah felt the plane shudder as the massive wheels extended into the airstream. The airport was getting closer now, the runway lights forming two parallel lines pointing straight ahead. It was her final combat mission in Afghanistan. Intelligence had located a high-value target in a compound outside Kabul, and Sarah was leading a four-ship formation of F-16s to provide close air support for the ground assault. As they approached the target area, the radio had erupted with chatter. Troops in contact, enemy fire, coordinates changing by the second. Through it all, Sarah had remained calm. She'd coordinated with the ground controller, identified the target, made the attack run while bullets traced past her canopy. When it was over, the ground commander's voice had come through clearly. Phoenix 1, that was perfect. You just saved a lot of lives down here. That night, back at base, Sarah had sat in her quarters and finally allowed herself to shake. Not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. People had lived because she'd done her job right. That was what mattered. 500 feet, Jenny called out. The runway was rushing up to meet them now. Sarah could see the approach lights, the threshold markers, the vast expanse of concrete where she needed to put this massive aircraft down safely. 400 feet. On glide slope. Sarah's hands were steady on the yoke. The plane felt heavy, much heavier than anything she'd ever flown, but it was flying true. The engines hummed with steady power. 300 feet, looking good. In the cabin, 300 people held their breath. Some were praying. Others were crying quietly. A few were gripping hands with strangers, united in their shared hope. 200 feet. The ground was rushing up fast now. Too fast maybe. Sarah pulled back slightly on the yoke, trying to arrest their descent rate without stalling the aircraft. 100 feet. 50 feet. The runway filled Sarah's vision. She could see every light, every marking on the pavement. This was it, the moment when everything either worked or didn't. 30 feet. 20. 10. Sarah pulled back on the yoke, lifting the nose slightly. The main landing gear touched down with a rumble that vibrated through the entire aircraft. For a moment, they bounced slightly, the massive plane trying to become airborne again, but Sarah held it down with gentle forward pressure. The nose gear settled onto the runway with a satisfying thump. Reverse thrust. Jenny called out, pulling the throttles into reverse. The engines roared, their thrust directed forward to slow the aircraft. Sarah applied the brakes carefully, feeling the plane decelerate as they rolled down the runway past the waiting emergency vehicles. United 447 Chicago Tower. Welcome to Chicago. Beautiful job. As the plane slowed to taxi speed, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking slightly now, the adrenaline catching up with her. She'd done it. They'd done it. Behind them, the cabin erupted. 300 people cheered, applauded, cried, and hugged strangers. The sound was overwhelming, pure joy and relief and gratitude rolling forward from the passenger compartment like a wave. Jenny was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Oh my God, thank you." Patricia looked up from where she was still monitoring Captain Morrison. "His pulse is getting stronger," she announced. "I think he's going to be okay." As emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft and paramedics boarded to attend to the captain, Sarah sat quietly in the right seat. The cheering continued behind her, passengers calling out thanks, flight attendants crying with relief. Marcus appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Captain Martinez," he said formally. "On behalf of United Airlines and everyone on this flight, thank you." Sarah nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Just glad I could help." "The passengers want to thank you personally." "That's not necessary." But it was too late. As Sarah made her way back to the cabin, she was met with a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Passengers reached out to touch her hands, her shoulders. An elderly woman pressed a handwritten note into her palm. A businessman offered her his business card, saying his company would be honored to work with her. The young man who'd been sitting next to her in 12C grabbed her hand. "I had no idea," he said, wonder in his voice. "You were just sitting there reading a book and I had no idea you were a hero." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who happened to have the right training at the right time." But as she looked around the cabin, at the faces filled with gratitude, at the families embracing, at Jenny Walsh being congratulated by the other crew members, Sarah realized something had changed inside her. For 15 years she'd been running from who she used to be. The nightmares, the weight of responsibility, the memories of war had driven her to seek anonymity, normalcy, invisibility. She'd thought that part of her life was over, that Captain Sarah Martinez was someone she used to be. But tonight she'd remembered something important. Some things you never stop being. The training, the instincts, the ability to stay calm when others panic, those weren't things you lost when you changed careers or moved to the suburbs or bought a sensible car. Those were things that stayed with you, waiting for the moment when they were needed again. As the passengers finally began to disembark, many stopping to thank her one more time, Sarah sat back down in seat 12C. Her paperback novel was still there, bookmark marking her place. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 2 hours ago. But everything was different. Her phone buzzed with a text message. The news media had somehow gotten word of the story already, and her phone number along with it. The message was from a reporter asking for an interview. Sarah deleted it without reading the whole thing. She'd dealt with enough reporters during her military career to know that path led only to complications. She wasn't looking for fame or recognition. She was just glad to be alive and glad that 300 other people were alive too. As she gathered her things to leave the plane, Sarah caught sight of herself in the small window reflection. Gray-streaked hair, reading glasses, sensible business clothes. She looked exactly like what she was, a middle-aged insurance agent from Denver. But now she knew that was only part of the story. The other part, the pilot, the officer, the woman who could land a crippled plane in the dark, was still there too. And maybe that was okay. Maybe being invisible wasn't about hiding from who you used to be. Maybe it was about carrying that person with you quietly, until the moment came when they were needed again. Sarah walked off United Flight 447 into the bright lights of the terminal, where she would catch a cab to her hotel and probably never see any of these people again. But she carried with her the memory of their faces in that moment when they realized they were going to live. It was enough. In the distance, an ambulance was rushing Captain Morrison to the hospital. The last Sarah had heard, his condition was improving. The doctors thought he'd make a full recovery. Jenny Walsh would go on to become a captain herself within 2 years, inspired by the events of that night to push herself beyond her comfort zone. She would think of Sarah Martinez every time she made a difficult landing. And somewhere in seat 12C of another flight, another ordinary-looking person with an extraordinary past would be sitting quietly, reading a book, waiting for their moment to help. Because heroes, Sarah had learned, rarely looked like heroes. They just looked like people until the moment when people needed them to be something more.